It's what I think is one of the 10 most intensive movies ever. Surprisingly, it's a silent movie. It's The Passion of Joan of Arc. Let me tell you why I think you should watch this movie and why you might like it and why you've watched it and come to this video coming up next. The 20th century saw a lot of Joan of Arc movies, over a dozen of them, by a lot of master directors. Here, this is one of the first Joan of Arc movies by Carl Theodor Dreyer, a beloved figure Joan of Arc, obviously in France, including among intellectuals. Mark Twain thought Joan of Arc was basically the greatest person in world history because she went from nothing, a rural small-town girl, into the savior of France, and then very quickly the tragic death of Joan of Arc as depicted in this movie by Carl Theodor Dreyer. Dreyer is Danish. He's making a French movie here, and this movie is extremely influential. In fact, they should still show it in film schools, and people in film classes should watch this because there are a lot of great basics of film grammar here in this Passion of Joan of Arc. Now, what makes it really intense is the film grammar, plus what I'm going to tell you, which is to watch the choral music on the Criterion Blu-ray. I think it's called Voices of Light, and it's a piece that you're going to play to the background of the Passion of Joan of Arc. There are a lot of different musical soundtracks for this movie, but this one was created, I think, fairly recently in the last 30 years. And it takes some actual 13th, 14th century music and puts it in the soundtrack. To me, it's extremely intense. I mean, the music makes it far more so, and that's why I like it a lot. Also making this movie intense, memorable, and great, and this may be the only thing that makes this movie great, but is Maria Falconetti's performance as Joan of Arc. As you know, movies are the artistic medium of the human face, and movie makers, propagandists, video makers, all kinds of people know a great face can make or break a movie. Maria Falconetti's performance here is absolutely heart-wrenching. It's amazing. She's got this sort of crazed but wandering look in her eye. She looks intense. She looks devoted. She looks like she's been touched by otherworldly things, like visions of Saint Michael, for example. She looks like she's being hounded by all the men in this movie, which she is. And it's a memorable performance. Plus, Dreyer's camera is always up in her face. We always get close to extreme close shots of her, no more than 2 feet away, usually. And that gives us the opportunity to stare at her face, to look at it intensely, and to sort of absorb and even feel her emotions. That alone is going to make this experience intense. Plus, this movie uses a lot of shots, almost 1,500 shots in its runtime, giving it really about 3.5 seconds per shot. That's extremely quick. Back in the silent period in the 1920s, this was possible. Things slowed down, I think, over the 20th century, but picked up the pace in terms of shots per second or shots per minute. And so you're going to find this movie moves quickly, at least according to cutting. So you get the music, the intensity of her face, and the cutting, plus Dreyer's occasional moving camera moving into place, usually into faces, sometimes zooming in, sometimes moving rapidly to a doorway or something like that. Really makes this movie more dynamic than it would seem, because most, if not all, of this movie is in close to extreme close shot of faces. And yet Dreyer incorporates moving cameras to give it even more intensity. Not that it needs more, but it has even more than you would expect. So then these shots of Joan of Arc are contrasted with the men, the quote theologians and lawyers who surround her. This movie is just the trial of Joan of Arc, based supposedly on the actual court records, verbatim from the document as shown at the beginning of the movie. And so you get this mob, as it says at the beginning, of theologians and lawyers surrounding and hounding this poor woman who's all by herself and being, harmed by them, and they are lording it over her. This goes along with a lot of themes in 20th century movies, especially early on, but all the way through, which is the individual against the masses or an individual against the mob. Crowd is something where people turn into animals, or they turn into rage-filled, frenzy-filled, really beasts, versus the saintly Joan of Arc figure who's given this mock crown, a la Jesus Christ. This is a lot like the trial of Christ as presented in the Gospels. And she is this intensely devoted person, singular in her vision, versus these madmen who surround her and want her to conform to the ways of the Catholic Church. She's called a simple and human woman at the very beginning, and we don't get anything about her background here. We get no scenes of her triumphs, of her military victories, of anything like that. It's just a trial And as you know, in execution, that's not a spoiler. And so because the film grammar is always intense and close shot, plus it's low camera angles usually on especially the men, those who are interrogating her, but oftentimes on her too, giving them all sort of this larger-than-life appearance, although sometimes Joan is located near the bottom of the screen in these very simple geometric shapes that are the background to her story life, and thus she is imprisoned in every single way by the conformity demanded on her by those who would try her. So the film grammar really amps up the intensity and makes these men larger than life, plus the lighting. There's a lot of soft lighting on Joan's face. Famously, there's no makeup used in this movie, which is extremely unusual for silent films. You get a lot of makeup in silent films. They almost look clownish to us who are used to more normalized or maybe organic makeup. Back then, they used a lot of eyeshadow, a lot of lipstick, and so on. But here, there's no makeup. So then Joan's face is plain, simple, and the soft lighting makes her look soft. It makes her look attractive even, to an extent, maybe sisterly or motherly in a way. Versus the harsh lighting put on the men, where you can see very intense whites but dark shadows in their wrinkles and the crevices. It gives them more of an ominous gothic look in contrast to Joan, who doesn't have the sort of contrast of very light, very dark places on her face. That makes obviously her the good person, as it were, in the movie. There are a lot of ways to read this movie, and a lot of ways to read the use of Joan of Arc throughout this century, why this would be a popular subject or a common subject for a movie throughout the 20th century. And one of them is obviously feminism, with the rise of women's rights, whatever that means, in Western countries at least, and probably around the world. The idea that women are oppressed by men to some degree, by patriarchy. Here it's the Catholic Church, but they're sort of stand-ins for any sort of group or cabal of men, whether it's government, whether it's church, whether it's family, or something like that. Plus, I already said the mob versus the individual, the great Joan versus the mob of men who surround her and would try and execute her because they're just conformist, whereas she is not. She is this individual with fantastic vision. But one way I definitely read this movie, and it's almost a prophecy, is of the terrible show trials all around the world, in Eastern Europe, China, communist countries, but other sorts of repressive regimes, and take their citizens and try them for crime, non-crimes even, and then execute them or put them in a gulag or something like that. That will happen throughout the 20th century. It's already happening, in places like Russia in the 1920s, late 1920s at this point. And it would happen later on in Germany, for example, all around the world in various places. So Joan is a figure of the oppression of government systems, or state systems, I should say. Which reminds me a lot, and this movie is sort of foregrounding or forecasting the end of 1984, the very famous novel, probably the most famous English language novel in the 20th century by George Orwell, in which the end he's imprisoned and sort of tried, at least tortured in that novel. And this is the trial and torture of Joan of Arc, and showcasing that victim who is horribly treated. It's, a trial is a mockery of justice and so on. So clearly the movie's on her side with the lighting and the film grammar, and then you get this messaging of this is the 20th century, or this is Europe, or this is the way that the dominant powers, the states, they're so powerful that they can become oppressive like this. And, Joan of Arc, although this is an old story, hundreds of years old by now, is a figure who can be re-envisioned for this period of time in which humongous governments rule the planet and can do what they want, maybe, to individuals if this is the way that they operate. For all these reasons, even though this is a silent movie and a lot of people out there do not like or watch silent movies, I think you will find this movie intensely interesting as well as intense. If nothing else, the ending of this movie is crazy and frenzied. It's unbelievable what happens to me in the last 5 minutes. All of those shots, it becomes more expressionistic as it goes. In the last 5 to 10 minutes, I will not spoil them, but study them for persuasion, propaganda, film grammar techniques. It's truly amazing what Dreyer did here. So this movie will continue to last forever because it will continue to be named in top 10, top 100 list, I think, partly just because of Falconetti's performance. What do you think of The Passion of Joan of Arc? Let us know in the comments, and please subscribe to this channel for more great content. Thank you. Have a great day. By the way, we could spend hours and hours analyzing this movie. Forgive me for what I did not mention, and please let us know in the comments what else should be said about this great movie.